With the addition of the Frenzy Mercenary in patch 2.4, there are a lot of questions that I think most people don't have the answers to when it comes to just how this mercenary's damage is calculated. And it doesn't help that their character screen is basically lying about every single damage number that you're seeing on it, regardless of how clean you think the calculation is. So I want to explain some of the hidden mechanics about how this mercenary works. Some of the things that we've been able to test and prove are still in the coding, even though this is a brand new mercenary, and what's the best way to get the most bang for your buck and save as many high runes as possible. So first, let's start with the fact that the character screen is just lying. So on top of the fact that most people know that the character screen doesn't properly calculate things, it has weird rounding errors, it doesn't always apply all your stats to every type of damage that you have, etc., etc., this mercenary goes even a step further. So let's take a couple items, toss them on there, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Some of the pretty obvious options for this mercenary are going to include things that have auras for you, or chance to cast procs, or just straight up raw damage. So obviously something like the Lawbringer, that's giving you Decrepify, the Sanctuary aura, that's going to increase your safety. Crescent Moon is a really good option, very cheap, and it's going to give you that static field in an area. Last Wish, I mean, you can't say enough about Last Wish, but the Life Tap, the Fade, the Might Aura, and the fact that you can dual wield these for that level 34 Might Aura. And then something really classic like the Grief, the penultimate damage weapon for most builds, and the Act 5 Mercenary is no exception. Lastly, for those really spicy individuals, there's going Dual Hand of Justice. I did test it out, it's pretty good. There are just so many different options for this mercenary that it's going to be difficult to nail down what is the best build. Now, the first thing to note is that when you have equipped a single weapon, it will actually use that weapon for both melee attacks. You'll see right here on our character screen that it is showing that damage being applied to both hands, but technically that should be impossible since they only have one weapon equipped. And if you don't have a weapon equipped, you should only be getting the mercenary's base damage. Every mercenary deals base damage even without a weapon. And then on top of that, he would use his frenzy stacks. But he can frenzy without having a weapon equipped. Equipping a single weapon, he is also able to frenzy, and it will use that weapon's damage in both slots. Now, it's really important to note that something like Last Wish, while they'll use the weapon base for the damage and theoretically for the chance to hit, it's not going to give you that double down of the Might Aura. You need to equip both weapons to get that double Might Aura. But you will have all of your chance to proc. So on attack, on striking, when struck, on death, on level up, will all proc as if that weapon was equipped in both hands. So if you're literally using only a Grief for pure DPS, you actually only need to equip a single Grief. You don't need to make a second one. So already right there, we're saving an extra low and a Mal rune just by only equipping a single weapon onto our mercenary. The same is true for something like Crescent Moon. Like I just said, those chance to cast on striking will proc as if the weapon was in both hands. So you're actually getting the exact same chance to proc that static field on striking as if you had equipped two weapons. So what this also means is that if you're rolling multiple Grief Rune words and you get a higher IAS and a higher damage version, putting that in the main hand and then not equipping a second Grief will actually net you more damage than it would to put on a weaker damage-based Grief. And remember how I said that the character screen is just lying? Well, Grief is actually a great example. You'll see that the damage values on the character screen are actually different per the hand that the Grief is equipped onto. So our primary weapon looks like it has about 356 additional damage than the offhand. And if you look, our Grief rolled 356 for that damage plus. Now, testing shows that the damage from Grief is applied to both hands, even if only one is currently equipped. So don't worry about what the screen is telling you. And then on top of that, remember the fact that the character screen does not multiply the damage from Grief by all of the off-weapon ED sources that you're supposed to have. So while it only looks like this mercenary is doing about 1,300 damage right now, this is actually being multiplied by a ton of off-weapon ED, you just don't see it on the screen. Now, what else do you need to understand about how the mercenary's damage gets calculated? Well, what I'm showing right here on the screen is an equation that was derived from a very old Diablo.net forum that's made its way across a large part of the internet, and this is typically where you get the slightly misleading fact that the mercenary gets something like 2 times minimum damage and 3 times maximum damage on its weapon roll. Now, a lot of people know that something like Ethereal Head Striker is one of the best options for your mercenary because of all of the flat damage that it gets, and then addition to the Deadly Strike, which we'll get to in just a second. But what you'll see from this equation is that the weapon's damage, as in the base weapon damage, plus any ethereal bonus, plus any on-weapon enhanced damage, all gets multiplied by 2 across the board. This is when the mercenary is wielding a weapon as a one-hander. So the normal Act 5 mercenary can use two-handed weapons in a single hand slot, but when he does that, you'll see that he actually doesn't get that ×2 damage across the board on the base. So right here, minimum and maximum damage on the weapon, at least the base of it, is getting ×2 multiplier the moment that you put a one-handed weapon onto your mercenary. And since the Frenzy Mercenary can only use one-handed weapons, testing in PvP and against modified mobs shows the fact that you are still getting that ×2 weapon damage on the newly coded Mercenary. So they haven't taken that out of the game. On top of that, if you look further into the equation, you'll see that sources of plus to minimum and plus to maximum are multiplied by 3. So what this means is any weapon that you can get, the higher the base weapon damage itself, i.e. getting an ethereal buff on a really high weapon damage, and then if that weapon were to have something like plus to maximum damage per level, all of that is going to undergo a ×2 and then a ×3 multiplier, and all that gets added together before it gets multiplied by your off-weapon ED. So what does all of that mean to... And remember when I said we'd get back to that Deadly Strike concept? Well, there's a very common myth that mercenaries don't benefit from Deadly Strike, and that's just not the case. They absolutely benefit from all forms of critical strike, so that's Deadly Strike, or if you were to give them plus to skill critical strike, like on the Amazon Runeword Armor piece, which actually gives you +2 critical strike as an O skill. On top of that, the Act 5 Mercenary actually has an inherent 5% chance to crit, so I'm going to call this Merc crit chance, and Merc crit chance rolls completely separately from your base critical strike roll. So first, you'll check Deadly Strike chance. If that fails, you'll attempt to critically strike based off of either Weapon Mastery, which you can now give to the Mercenary, or from giving them Critical Strike skill like on Peace Runeword. And then if you successfully crit there, you have a 5% chance to crit again. So there's actually a total of a 4 times modifier of all weapon damage if your mercenary manages to successfully double crit. Now, there are some things to be said between the differences of the Frenzy Mercenary and the base Act 5 Mercenary. Obviously, this version of the Mercenary is able to stack more auras and bring more varying effects to the table, since you literally get to equip 2 weapons. But something that a lot of people don't know is that the base Barbarian Mercenary, when it attacks, so not when it uses Bash, but when it attacks, actually does a double attack every single attack. So while you'll think that Frenzy is double the speed, double the fun, double the damage, the base Mercenary actually already also benefits from double attack. And since they can also benefit from all of the ×2 and then ×3 on min-max values by using a one-hander, their DPS is going to be very comparable and in some cases actually potentially better than the Frenzy Mercenary. That being said, the Frenzy Mercenary does have the ability to cast Taunt, which is a single target, which reduces how many monsters are going to have curses removed from them if you are using something like Lawbringer to apply Decrepify. Since the Bash Mercenary now casts Battlecry, which is going to remove that curse in an area of effect around him. And speaking about the difference between Battlecry and Taunt, while it's almost impossible to actually show in-game or to test properly, working with some other amazing people in the community who do much better testing than I do and are also able to crunch the numbers better than I am. There is some signs that are pointing towards when this mercenary uses the taunt skill, it is interrupting their attack, although you can't see it since he doesn't have a taunt animation. This would lead us to believe that some of the AI decision to taunt as opposed to attack might actually reduce his DPS further, but again, it's just very difficult to actually test this or show it in game without an animation to attribute it to. The effect just goes off, it appears, and a monster comes running over. So how do you put a nice bow onto this, or at the very least, a very simple too long didn't watch? 1. You only need to apply a single weapon for the purposes of damage and attack chance when using this mercenary, because they will apply that weapon to both hands. If you're looking to benefit from chance to cast procs, you also only need to have the weapon in a single slot, and you don't need to make 2 of them. So only make 1 Crescent Moon, only make 1 Grief, and only make 1 Lawbringer, unless you're trying to get a very high level Sanctuary or to knock back undead even further. When using something like a Last Wish to get the benefit of the level 34 aura, you do need to make and equip both weapons, so I'm sorry we can't cheat out a secretly high level Might aura from abusing this similar mechanic. Similarly, something like the Hand of Justice, to get an even higher level Holy Fire aura, you're going to have to equip 2 as well. Now, I will say that I believe that the Frenzy Mercenary is a much better mini Dragondon than the Act 3 Mercenary, because he will also swing the weapons and actually get the benefit of the massive elemental fire on weapon strike, as opposed to the Act 3 Mercenary that never attacks with its weapon. Furthermore, before you have teleport, putting a single Crescent Moon onto the Act 5 Mercenary is going to much more consistently get you those static field charges applied to monsters than the Act 3 Mercenary, because the Act 3 Mercenary tends to not use static if they need to reposition to avoid monsters, and they will more often static once you're able to teleport consistently. Lastly, the new Frenzy Merc is just strictly a better tank in almost every scenario than the previous Mercenary, because A, you're going to be able to keep your applied Decrepify on more targets, since Taunt is a single target ability, and Battlecry removes it from an area around them whenever they apply that skill. And then on top of that, this Mercenary is going to have a much higher defense pool because they have access to Iron Skin, which are able to buff up with plus to skills. Whereas on the normal Act 5 Mercenary, while Battlecry will reduce incoming damage, getting hit at all means that you're taking damage that you otherwise could have avoided. Lastly, something that I don't think a lot of people are necessarily thinking about is that one of the biggest detractors from a Mercenary's DPS output is whether or not they can get into range to attack a monster. Once this dude gets his max frenzy charges up, he is faster than almost every other character other than a frenzy barb. So he'll actually be meeting you at the monsters in record time compared to other mercenaries that would typically either get stuck behind because they weren't fast enough and inevitably have to teleport pop over to you, or once they kill a monster, they literally take less time to get to the next monster. So they're applying their DPS more regularly and faster than any other mercenary does. So I hope that going over a lot of very hidden and archaic mechanisms about how this Act 5 Mercenary calculates its damage, uses weapons, applies on hit effects, etc., so that you can A, make the best version of the mercenary that you can, B, save yourself a ton of high runes, and C, make sure that you're actually equipping the weapons as you should to get the maximum benefit out of it. All in all, I think that the new Merc is absolutely phenomenal. I love watching this dude Zerg rush around and absolutely cap monsters at Mach speed. And I'm really excited to see ultimately what the best combination of weapons ends up being when we remember the fact that you're getting that ×2 base and that ×3 to min and maximum damage application. I hope that this video helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.